Let's do it. Lock party's out. I'm host Mike Wahle. Thanks for watching. If you're enjoying, please subscribe, rate, review on our YouTube channel, Process to Perform. Hit me up, Mike Wahle68 on Twitter or X. Process to Perform on Instagram. Wearing the old Caffeine and Kilos t-shirt here, little hole. Just, hey, trying to get a sponsorship, guys. Come feel me out. Come hit me up. Feel me out. That'd be weird. Our show is sponsored by Bet Online. Bet Online is your number one source for all your summer sports needs this season, from Major League Baseball, golf, NBA, and the NHL playoffs. All the latest stats, news, and scores available to follow your favorite teams. Get the latest odds and lines, including the latest team matchups, player props, and odds on just about every sport out there. Head to the website today or use your mobile device to get on the action. Bet Online, where the game starts. Again, weird time in the this is a weird time in the NFL. A couple of the guys that I work with just started doing some of the team practices. Boy, what a different. I remember my last year, and I don't think anybody will get in trouble for this, but I remember Jim Mora was coaching the Seattle Seahawks, and I was doing rehab. It's rehab for my shoulder, my second shoulder surgery. So I was part of the team, but you're kind of on the fringe. I actually had to retire the first game of the season, first day of the season. But this is during mini camps, and I'm watching some mini camp practices last couple of days, doing some work for some guys, and the difference is, man, like the pace. I remember Jim Mora was, I think the NFLPA guys had to come in like 3 or 4 days out of like 2 weeks because they were doing 1v1s all the time. I mean, it's just trying to get away with everything. I know they cost draft picks now and all that stuff, but it's definitely the NFL's changed, and it just got me thinking. It got me thinking, and I wanted to do an episode about, everybody my age always says, oh, our generation was better. Of course, the generation before that says that. Of course, right now, when you visually watch sports on television and the way we capture it, I think you could certainly make the argument that the best athletes in the world are playing today, potentially better athletes than they were 20 years ago, potentially better athletes than have ever walked the face of the earth. I think when you look at some guys in sport, in any generation, you can make those statements. But I was wanting to look at the difference in maybe kind of athleticism, development, and professionalism over the last, let's say, 20, 30 years as compared to where we are right now. It's always one of those things that pops up because I do think that sports change, the priorities change, the life cycle of the organization or the league changes. You look at like basketball, and you always ask the question: can different players play in different eras? I was a basketball guy growing up first, and Michael Jordan's easily the number one guy. For Kobe would be the number two, LeBron would be number three. Because when I was, the reason is. There's two reasons. One, when I was growing up, we never thought about the length of your career defining how great you were. In other words, if Kareem played for 22 years or whatever it was, it doesn't make him better than Michael Jordan because Michael Jordan took a year off. He, really, in his prime, he was the best player that anybody had ever seen. And that's kind of what mattered the most. I think we've skewed that. We certainly moved the hurdle or the goalpost on that one really because of LeBron James and his longevity and guys like Tom Brady as well and his longevity. But there's also this, the same reason that people really like Allen Iverson and people really like Steph Curry now is when you have a guy like Shaq, when you have a guy like LeBron James, who literally LeBron James is probably the best athlete I've ever seen do anything ever. I mean, there's just, you don't see a lot of humans walking around at 6'8", 6'9". He probably in his prime was walking around at 270, 275, has a 40-inch vertical jump, can run like a wind. I mean, it's just like that human doesn't exist. He's one of one. Shaq was one of one. There's not other people that are walking around the earth like him. And so there's this, even though you can have these really phenomenal athletes, there are other athletes in the case of Michael or Kobe who are 6'6", who can jump, who can run, who have good hand-eye coordination. And so the differentiation then is more of skill and basketball IQ, resiliency, kind of the ability to capture the moment. Those things matter more than just pure athleticism. Athleticism is important, but it's not necessarily the defining feature. I think when you talk about football players, especially non-quarterback players, I think that you have to look at you look at Tom Brady and the duration of his career. Obviously, the rings is the most impressive thing, but you also look at the duration of the career, and not a great athlete starting out. I think his 40 time when he retired was better than when he started at the combine. I don't think that you look at the duration of one's career and whether or not they're where they rank as the greatest, at least from an athlete's perspective. This could be media is different. But when I look at you look at the best guys I played against at linebacker, for example, the top guy is Patrick Willis. And I played against him for like 3 years and he retired, I think, after 8 years. And he's the best player I've ever seen at that position. And it's probably, it's not that it's not even close, but the gap is pretty big. I mean, he was very, very unique in his ability to attack a lineman, attack a defender. I didn't get to play against Luke Kuechly. I think he's very similar. So maybe there's guys that are like that, but they've ended their careers early. It's not the duration of the career, it's just how great they were in that moment. When you look at some of the older guys, you could say that too, especially the linebacker position. Now, going to football or going to the quarterback, when you talk about Tom Brady, I've seen Dan Marino highlights. I know Dan Marino. I can't sit here and tell you that Tom Brady's a better thrower of the football than Dan Marino, right? Because it's a team sport, 22 players, Bill Belichick's your coach, et cetera, et cetera. Michael Vick is the most talented quarterback I've ever seen with my own eyes in terms of elite mastery of throwing a football, one of the strongest arms I've ever seen, and then completely unique in his ability to run. I mean, different than, at least at the time, different than anybody else you'd ever seen. You can make the argument that Lamar Jackson is potentially in that vein now, but like when Michael Vick started taking off, scrambling, flipping his hips, throwing the ball from right to left, left-handed, 50 yards down on a rope, you just started going, well, that doesn't make any sense. He's not in the GOAT argument. There's a bunch of different reasons for that. But until Tom Brady, until LeBron, my point is we didn't, as athletes, go, well, that he played it so long he's at such a high level for so long. That's why it mattered. It was more in their prime, like who's the guy that you want the most. Now, when you look at positional players in football, you talk about your offensive, defensive linemen, you talk about your linebackers, your running backs, your tight ends, violent positions. The status of these guys is over a 4 or 5 year period, not a 15 or 20 year period. Okay. And I really think I think that's for a couple of reasons. And I think this is kind of where guys like me, who, really playing in the 2000s, view the game differently now. And maybe guys who are playing in the 80s view the game differently as well. Back then, guys were just blowing it out more than they are now, right? Training camp was harder. Practices were harder. More days in pads, more physical practices, more competition. Weightlifting sessions were absolutely insane. Like my buddy coach and I joke, like if we had Instagram and we just put a camera up in UNLV's weight room and people got to see what we were doing on the daily for the amount of time, just the shit that we were doing from a lifting standpoint to get ahead. The strongman stuff. I mean, just absolutely just totally different, right? I think that does something to you. It hardens you as an athlete. It gives you incredible confidence in your preparation. But you're building your body, you're building your game to maximize your ceiling. And then you understand, like I used to know, like it's better to burn out than to fade away. I knew that I was taking years off the longevity of my career potentially because of the work that I was doing. I just felt that it was more than justified to do so because, sorry about the camera, guys, to do so because I would rather burn out than fade away. I would rather see how great I could get. And then if I ever got to where I thought that was optimal, maybe then you start thinking about maintaining it. But like the drive to get to that level was just, was the most important thing. The most important thing, because back then you're making a lot of money, right? But the money, there were a lot of other professions that were making as much, if not more, which is not necessarily true today. But the motivation was, I want to make it. I want to be this football player. This is what I want to do with my life. I want to see where my ceiling is. And I didn't, like, at least me and most of my comrades didn't feel like you could do that unless you were pushing yourself in practice every day, unless you were pushing yourself in the weight room every day, unless you were doing everything you could to kind of recover and all that, all of that kind of stuff. So I think back then maybe, and again, this is all very general statements, right? Like obviously there's people nowadays, you watch JJ Watt, who just retired. Maybe he's more of that generation than this generation. You see guys that are really working hard in the offseason now. But I'm just making kind of some general things, and a lot of it has to do with, obviously what the NFLPA's done to the offseason training. Another thing that we talk about is the actual kind of skill of the players now versus then. And I'm not talking about natural athletic ability, but just skill, not like evolution of man, just skill. So movement patterns, technique, decisions, skill. Okay. And again, got to speak generally here. It's not the same across the board. But if you start looking at like what determines a skill in a confrontational sport, let's talk like about it's violence, or the threat of violence is a very good key to unlocking skill. So if you look at like what are the most violent sports in the world, you talk about hand-to-hand combat, mixed martial arts, boxing, kung fu, etc. The best practitioners of violence are the most skilled athletes at their craft in the world. So you look at the MMA champions, the lightweight champs, the middleweight, the light heavyweight champion. Those guys, for their size, are athletes, but they're the practitioners of skill at the highest level. Because when you're entering into a single combat cage, you enter into a cage, Thunderdome, two men enter, one man leave. That triggers a deep-rooted genetic drive for survival. And you have to think in terms of aim small, miss small, sniper's mentality, in terms of inches, right? Details matter. The automation of basic techniques matters. And so when you look at the top guys, you look at the top athletes, like those guys are masterful in their skill, their ability to see a situation, Rolodex it through their brain, recall it, react to what they see. The less violence, the less skill required. Along those lines, you think the less violence, the more decisions that might not be as important. Therefore, the less skill is required. You look at football now. Tom Brady said this a bunch of times. A bunch of quarterbacks have said this, especially guys that either are retiring or have retired. Because of the rule changes in football, you are allowed to make some poor decisions that would in normal times have a lot greater chance of violent endings or injury, but that has been dampened by the league's wantness to not have injuries to key positions. So the level of decision-making has gone down at certain positions in the National Football League because violence has been suppressed. And that's not to say that some of these guys are incredible athletes, can do all these different things, but it's just a fundamental part of human nature. When the stakes aren't as high, the training won't be as intense and the delivery of skill won't be as consistent or precise. One thing that's happened, and we can look to basketball or football for this, basketball is sometimes easier, is the level of athleticism and the way that we are delivered content now, social media, top 10 highlights, everywhere you look, multiple media outlets that are just feeding narratives, that are always creating narratives and then reinforcing narratives with the same clips over and over and over. So we think that it's cardinal law or canon law. You look at what happens is you look at we stop thinking about what is skill really. You look at like a Kyrie Irving. Kyrie Irving might be the best dribbler in the history of basketball. So it would be, or Steph Curry is the best shooter in the history of basketball. Right now, as far as long range, he's redefined the sport, certainly generational kind of difference maker. And so because of the Kyrie Irving highlights, because of the long distance shooting, we have now looked at that and said, well, these are the most skilled guys we've ever seen. And I don't want to dismiss anything that they're doing or they've done, but you can also make the argument that an outstanding trait of skill that we don't think about maybe when it comes to basketball is something that's maybe a little less sexy. Post footwork, right? Your ability to pull up off the dribble, mid-range game, like anything that we take for granted, like the basics of the sport. Your footwork's usually the easiest one to kind of think about, especially as it pertains to basketball, right? Being able to play with both hands, mid-range jumpers off the backboard with your left hand. Guys like Kobe Bryant could do. I mean, got really, really talented guys back in the day. Still, you look at the footwork now and you go, okay, that's at par at least with the best players of this era, even though the game is always trying to evolve. I look at soccer and I go, Ronaldinho for me is the most aesthetically pleasing person to watch play soccer ever. He's my age. This was my generation. From a skill standpoint, from a showy standpoint, I don't know if there's a guy you ever have seen that can just do as many things at a high speed than he can. But then you watch Zidane dribble. Not as flashy, but just as effective. Then you watch the original Ronaldo, like a freight train. Had crazy techie skills, right? But his ability to push the ball in the right distance to shoot with accuracy all the time, like Karim Benzema, Lionel Messi, these guys are skilled in a different way. It's not as flashy, so it doesn't show up on your YouTube highlights as much, but it's still skill. We just don't necessarily value it like we used to. It's always like I tell my kids, if you can't receive a ball, why are you working on shooting? Because you're never going to get the chance. In football, at my position, if your footwork's poor and all you're working on is your punch, what are you doing? I just read we're trying to talk about a guy who said his punch is the strongest thing he's got, but you look at his footwork and his footwork's not right. So the way that we interpret skill, I think, is different across the board now than it used to be. And we romanticize the things that you can put on highlight tapes, but I don't know that it's different. I think there were more players in the NFL that were the really good at the basics of the sport than 15 years ago, 25 years ago than there are now, because of what I just said. And there's reasons, and it's not really the fault of the players. It's just how the sport has evolved. So the first is what we just discussed: passing decisions, footwork separation. They all matter more when the defense can try to end you on every single play. Rule changes have had a significant effect. We've talked about it. We've heard it from a lot of quarterbacks. The other thing that's going on, there's some fundamental changes in the life cycle of the sport that are now affecting skill. Number one, money. The average player salary has tripled in the last 15 years. Salaries at the top have gone up almost fivefold from when I was playing. Okay. So strictly from a financial, measure that versus inflation, it's not even close. So strictly from a financial sense, it makes a lot more sense now for a player to think about the length of their career at 80% of their capacity, right? Then blowing it out, finding their ceiling at 90%. No one's going to get to 100, but getting as close to 100% as you can, and maybe shortening your career by a couple of years, right? I want to be the best I can do it, like Aaron Donald. I'm going to do the best I can. And when I feel like I've done that, I'm going to leave. Most people don't have that mentality. That's why Aaron Donald's so special. J.J. Watt, top 10 in sacks in his last year. He could have played more years. 3-time defensive player of the year, done everything he needs to do, doesn't need the money anymore. So he's gonna when he feels like he talks about squatting 800 pounds, doing some of the crazy stuff he did. Well, that's why he was who he was, but not a lot of less players have that mentality now than they used to. Because you're talking about tens of millions of dollars that these guys are losing by kind of putting it all out there and going for it and trying to find your ceiling versus, hey, I think 80% of the best of me is going to get me another 4 years in the league. That could be potentially somewhere between 20 and $80 million. Number two, the NFL has gone from a player development league, draft and develop, because we didn't have free agency. So the guys you draft, the guys you're going to have. All right. Then we cut down in all the bargaining and everything. We cut down the amount of time we could spend in the building. So development and the type of coach that was hired is different than it used to be. They grew up on Madden, scheme heavy, maybe light in the technical area, maybe a little bit lighter in the intimacy of confrontational kind of matters. So now we move to an athlete ID model. So you have your scheme fit. Does this player fit the scheme that we want to run? And can we pick up a guy that does fit the scheme? We don't have to develop this guy. We'll just go pick up that guy in free agency. And now we're entering via social media. The NFL is entering a much more a cycle focused much more on brand development, both team branding, league branding, shield branding, but also individual branding. More games, more exposure, more dollars. So priorities change with these life cycles. As they change, priorities change. The priorities of the individual as well as the league changes. And so the game has adjusted that and adapted to that by changing the rules on the field, but also changing the amount of time they spend at the building. So what does the coach always say? We need more time. I'm on a meeting with coaches on Fridays. What's the number one thing? We need more time, especially with our quarterbacks, because they don't get to where they need to be. And then the last thing we kind of just discussed, athleticism is king on social media. So outlandish plays are king on social media. We want to see highlight plays. Like, we don't want to see Tony Cruz is retiring today. He's a Real Madrid midfielder. He's one of the greatest midfielders that will ever live. He started at Bayern Munich's academy, played first team Bayern Munich, won the Champions League with Bayern Munich, with Real Madrid, played there since 2014. His lifetime passing completion percentage is over 90%. You don't even know he's in the game. And then you read his stat line at the end of the year and you go, oh my God, this guy is just one of the most masterful players you'll ever see. He doesn't look like he's ever even trying hard. He doesn't even sweat. German guy, unbelievable. Absolute legend. Every midfielder should model their game after him. But you'll never see him on highlight tapes. Once a year, twice a year, you'll see him on highlight tapes because he just does the basics so well, but is not flashy. One of the best players ever. But if you're not a real soccer fan, you might have never heard of him. Quarterback scrambles. Flipping your hips and throwing it 50 yards on a rope. A breakaway run. A blindside block. Things that take loads of athleticism are what you see on social media, what you see on YouTube, what you see on ESPN. A lot of these things can be a result of kind of poor skill by the opponent. And we're just capitalizing on somebody's bad decision-making, bad idea, bad skill. That sells a lot more than 4 yards in a cloud of dust. Watching Amon run 4 or 5 yards at a time, right? Nobody watches that. What they watch is the 98-yard touchdown run against Denver in 2003 or whatever, right? That's the one that everybody wants to see. Especially with the individual brand development. I think Tom Brady talked about this at the NFL Rookie Symposium recently. That part of the game, all of that is creating more eyeballs on more dollars. Taylor Swift creates more eyeballs on all dollars. It doesn't make the product better, but it makes it more consumer friendly. And so the kids, the Green Bay Packers that understand, look, let everybody do that, but I really got to think about being the best version of myself. And then when I get to that, what I think that is, see how long I can maintain that level. Those are the kids that are going to make the difference in their careers, and obviously because of that, for the team careers. And then so you start talking about who's doing that generationally. You think about it this way: like Bo Jackson played 30 years ago. He ran like a 4.1 hand time at the Auburn Combine on his way to track practice. Didn't have a speed development guy. He's a track guy, right? But didn't have like a guy teaching him how to run a 40. Deion Sanders walked out of a limo allegedly at the Combine and ran like a hand time 4.2. Okay, these guys are played 30 years ago. I mean, records that have been challenged or broken, but in order to do so, how much extra work did you have to do to squeeze out a 1/10 of a second at a combine that doesn't really matter versus like how fast, when you watch the eyeball, how fast were those guys on the field, right? Larry Allen was killing. I mean, can you imagine Larry Allen playing today with some of the guys you see on the field at the deep tackle position that are trying to like muscle up? 700-pound bench press, ran a 4.6 or something like that. I think overall now, I looked up this list of like draft just question mark guys, and Bo, Mike Mamula, Terrell Suggs wasn't a good guy. Anquan Bowden doesn't necessarily have good like play speed wise, but just think of natural athleticism versus like combine times. Those two guys didn't put up great combine times, but phenomenal athletes, phenomenal skill from back in the day. Think about remember a guy like Vernon Davis and what he did? He just basically broke the combine for tight ends. I think maybe overall, if you look at the totality of football right now, kids start younger. They have from an S&C standpoint, I think they have higher level training at a younger age, and that continues through. So you would hope that they move better. They've been in better programs, and they maybe on average, I think we have stronger guys. You're always going to have those kind of outliers. Some of the guys I just talked about. I always find it interesting because it just makes it's not good or bad. And there's no like, if you want to say these guys are better or 25 years ago they were better, it always just, you're looking for the opportunities. Where are the opportunities to get ahead? If you're a Green Bay Packer and you want to become the best version of you, what were the people that you look up to the most doing to get there, right? The J.J. Watts, the Aaron Donalds, like that mentality. Do you want that kind of career, or do you want to play at a violent position? Are you more interested in trying to push this thing out and see if I can get 20 in? I don't know. I guess what I'm saying is I don't know if you can have it both ways. I really don't know if you can have it both ways. And you look at, like, Tom Brady played quarterback. It's a different position. It just is. When you look at LeBron James in basketball and what he's been able to do, first of all, one of one athlete. But there's also been times in his career, I think, that you could look at from a defensive standpoint, maybe he's not, or even from games played, things change from season to season. And he's done a really good job of kind of just being there when it matters because of the way their season goes and playoffs and whatnot. I don't know if you can do that in the NFL. But it's always kind of interesting to compare and contrast these different generations and try to figure out what guys were doing and how can we evolve? How can we maybe take some of that back? What lessons can we learn in order to make sure that we're making our ceiling as high as possible. We're also actually actively trying to reach it. And then the question obviously becomes, if you're a Green Bay Packer personnel guy or coach, what kind of player are you more interested in? Are you more interested in, the Pete Carroll model was so interesting to me when he got to Seattle because he was like, we're going to draft guys who are just want to be the best players at their position in the history of the game. We're going to practice so hard, right? We're going to own practice standards for the National Football League. We're going to compete. I'm going to put them on the field to compete. And some of those guys are going to make it 4 years and I'm going to have to replace them. Some of the really unique special ones, I'm going to give them second contracts. And we're going to ride this thing as long as we can. And Pete's a unique guy. He has a unique leadership style. He's special. But if you talk to people around the league, they practice the hardest. Everybody understood his philosophy. Wasn't pulling any punches. Obviously, you could do that with some of the contracts with the quarterback. Russell Wilson being a young guy at the time, etc. Like, let's not. Everything has to come together, right? John Schneider hit on some guys for sure, but you have to have an understanding of what kind of guy you want. Do you want a guy like an Aaron Donald or a JJ Watt who say, "I want to change the game. I want to be the best player at my." I want, Larry Allen. I'm coming here to change the way they talk about that position. That's my goal. Those guys aren't necessarily going to last at violent positions as long as other players. And so it's just interesting when you're having that conversation. Okay, what is it that you're trying to get out of your career? Do you want to be the best player that you could possibly be for 10 years and call it quits, 8 years and call it quits? Or do you want to hit 80% and go for 15 years and make more money? What matters the most to you? Some guys are going to be able to do both. And I'm sure if you're watching this, you're going to be able to go, well, what about so-and-so? He did it for 15 years. He was really good. I get it. I'm giving examples. I understand you can give examples. My point is, in my experience, myself, guys around me, it's tough to have that both ways. I think once the time you get to that spot where you're like, I think I'm at my ceiling, trying to maintain that, a lot of injuries, a lot of bang, I can tell you that I would guess that although this was, my shoulder was a one-off injury. In other words, it happened on one single play where everything blew up. I don't know if I would have done anything differently during my career. Would that have made it better or worse? Who knows? Okay, switching gears. People ask me about Travis Glover. And so I just watched some clip tape on him. And honestly, like, he's 6'6", 317. He comes out of Georgia State. There's a couple things that are super interesting about him. He's not a traditional Packer. He did drop 15 pounds for his pro day. That always bothers me because I'm like, in my mind, why were you 15 pounds overweight? Is that weight going to come back? How serious are you about this? Did an agent or a combine prep guy get you and say, dude, you got to look better for the combine. We got to get you where you need to be. He's a 5-year starter at Georgia State, played a couple different positions. 23 reps on the bench. For a 6'6", 317 long arm guy, not a great number, quite frankly. So he's losing weight. He's not incredibly strong. He ran a 5'2", 740. Now, you guys know about my RIS stuff. It's fun to talk about. His number is quite low. It's like sub 5. I think it's like 4.72 or something like that. And I think I have it right here. So when you look at shuttle, 3-cone, 20-yard split, 10-yard split, broad jump, there's some limited, tangible, athletic movements that you do see transfer onto the tape. He is 6'6". He does have long arms. He looks a lot bigger than that when you're watching this film. There's some things you can pull away from here, and I'll just put it up now. He's 6'6", 317. He looks bigger. This is against LSU. I just showed the first drive. Now, he holds his hands low. Now, some guys are teaching this. You just look at that body position. I personally, it's okay. You want to see some changes, right? Carries them low. He does shoot them straight out, but it promotes kind of this high-chested target. So he actually gets kind of pushed around a little bit sometimes for being such a big guy. You see here again with the redirect. Doesn't get a lot out of his first kick. I think some of that's his stance. It can be fixed. Lateral movement's okay. Ends up on the ground here. Again, it's one of those guys where he's a huge dude, and he's just gonna have to, like, if it's me, if I'm communicating with him, I'm like, hey man, we're gonna jump rope every day, right? Just to get that rhythm, just to get that light feet, over and over and over. Free play here, no big deal. Look at the discipline. What a unit. Go to the next one here. So we got a double look, hipped off, coming across. So kind of takes some weird footwork. He's on the backside here. Takes some weird footwork, steps behind him. But what we're really looking at here is your initial footwork's not great. Your hands, he does everything with this shovel motion, okay? And guys look, a lot of people are teaching this technique now. And I have to tell you, it doesn't work for a lot of guys. And the reason is they don't have the body type. It puts them up so the defensive end gets in their chest too much. The idea being that you're bringing your hands and your hips together, but you're kind of scooping from low to high, so everything's in union. You're coming up like this. In pass pro, it's difficult because you can chop your hands down. In the run game, it's difficult because you're literally giving them your chest to press back, and you're turning it into you're thrusting your hips forward, but you have nowhere to go. In other words, you've kind of maximized your hip thrust on contact, and now you're just trying to waddle out of position instead of trying to drive somebody like you were pushing a car. Okay, so your power angles aren't really ideal. They're ideal for the split second on contact, but now your footwork and everything else isn't where you want it to be. And you see, like in this position, you've got two hands pushing against your chest. You're raising up, your hips are engaged, but you can't go anywhere. So this is a coaching thing. He might get coached this way by the Packers. This is something that's happening a lot in the National Football League, again, because you have a limited understanding of biomechanics and how the body moves. So it's like they read the first chapter and said, they put the book down and said, okay, we know what we need to do now. You'd like to see, a straight back here a little bit more. I think this is going to be a low hand. Yep. Okay. So I love the dip here. This is what really this is the first rep where I was like, oh, we've got something. He takes some footwork, but he actually sinks down, and not a lot of guys do this, especially at his size. He does a really good job of sinking down and creating contact low to high here. This is fantastic. Now, the hands aren't great. Again, this is a guy that said in an interview, his hands were his strength. He was really violent. Me personally, I don't see that at all. Right? I think they're actually something he really can improve on from a strike standpoint. However, I really like the way that he sunk down here. You see his hands right here, on the back of the guy's pads. It's because of his technique. So this can be improved. But that little bend, it's like you got to find the nuggets. Like, what are you looking for? Are you looking for all the stuff he does wrong? Or are you looking for those one or two things that if he can do that, you feel like you got a chance, right? So we can sit here and critique all the stuff he's doing wrong, or we can sit here and go, I can work with that. And I think you can work with that. Same idea. Good bend. Look at the dip. I love it. But you see outside hands. Just got to improve the strike. And there's a lot of little drills you can do on your own, pre-practice, post-practice, little routines you can get where you can be automatic with these hands. Fundamentally, the shovel effect that he's trying to do is just, I think, for most players, it's very tough. Steve Hutchinson came into the league and he was able to do this at a really, really high level. And it kind of, because of, maybe it's not because of him, but like at least as a guard in my mind, when I started watching Steve doing this and how easy it was for him because of his very, very unique athleticism, high school All-American, college All-American, NFL Hall of Fame player. Not a lot of those dudes walking around, okay? Because of his uniqueness, I think a lot of people looked at it and said, oh, that's going to be our standard. It makes sense. It makes sense for him. It's like when I told you guys how my agent said, oh, you want to learn how to block Dana Stubblefield, watch Larry Allen. And I said, don't ever tell me to watch film again because I can't bench 700 pounds. Larry Allen's he's a one-of-one player. I'm not at that level physically. Therefore, I can't mimic what he's trying to do. Get down here to the 20. Again, you just see the size of the guy. This is LSU, man. This is the SEC talent here we're talking about. And he moves this guy right off the ball, moving SEC talent right off the ball on a drive block. And still, hands aren't great, right? But you see the dip, that gut drop, man. I can't tell you if I'm a personnel guy and I'm watching tape, like that is, I mean, I have some very specific things I'm looking for, and that is right up at the top of the list. Can this person do that? Can he? Because now you can engage your hips. So this is the first true pass pro up. I think this is a touchdown. Not a lot with his first step, but he's under control. Shoots his hands straight, which is a big deal when you play your hands low. If you can bring them up here, it's not the ideal thing to do, but it's certainly a lot better than bringing them up like this. So I like this. I like this rep. I like the balance. I like the touchdown. I'm not going to show a lot. You can gain a lot of information from very few if you know what to look for, very few clips. So not the prototypical Green Bay Packer. Obviously, there's some body composition development that's going to be taking place by the kid at jump rope. Really, really work on his technique. We're talking about initial footwork, especially in pass pro. And then you're really talking about the initial hand placement off the snap is going to help you. If you improve that, you're going to help you on targeting. But this is all stuff, quite frankly, guys, where, I was talking to a pro guy yesterday, and I go, if you want, you can sit there and do it with a guy over and over and over and over and over again. And if you want to get good at this stuff, the pro goes off by himself and does it over and over and over again. Goes before and after practice and does it over and over and over again. And those guys are the guys that find success. But I think there's a chance for this guy. Okay, I have one listener question I wanted to address. It was interesting. They were talking about the 46 defense. He's talking about Jim Johnson, but really you think about the Bears when you think about the 46 defense, okay? And he was asking me, what's the difference? Well, what are the challenges in offensive lineman between like the 46 and what today's running the nickel fronts? Well, the 46 was a true 8-man front. You'd have your nose, who's like a 2-gapper. You have 2-3 techniques, okay? And you'd have the Sam linebacker walked up on the tight end. You'd have the strong safety usually outside the Sam linebacker. So you had these guys on the line of scrimmage. So you're looking at about 5 across, okay? And then, 6 across, linebackers in the back, the Will and the Mike. Man coverage, cover 3, but you're 3 deep, right? So three sections of the field, cover 3, cover 1. So what are the challenges there? The real challenges are everything is happening in confrontations. There's so many confrontations happening in the line of scrimmage. And with that strong safety, if you want to, you could fire that gun. You can run like a Sam Mike. You can run a Sam strong safety. And you can run that. If you're on the Sam on the tight end in man coverage, you can still run the strong safety Mike. You can really start attacking the offense on their side of the line of scrimmage because more often than not, you're not going to have a player in place. This is back when we run a lot of 21 personnel, by the way. Player in place that's going to be on the line of scrimmage to attack that strong safety. That strong safety can play on our side of the line of scrimmage if he wants to. Now, it's not always the best because you can pin and pull, you can trap, you can do all these things, but it does add to the immediacy of confrontation. And what we've always talked about on this show, when you're talking about the trenches, you want to enter into a confrontation on your own time frame. When somebody else is forcing you to rush, that's when things become very, very difficult. So that is, I would say that is the immediate problem with running a 46. When you look at today's nickel, you have different personnel, and so you take out a linebacker, right, add another DB. In nickel defenses, you can have any number of people on the line of scrimmage, but generally the principle is, for a lot of years it was bend but no break. So we'll have like a 5, usually a 6-man, but even sometimes a 5-man box, and we're playing quarters coverage or some sort of shell defense with 2 guys deep at least, right? And you're you're basically saying, I don't think you guys can drive 80 yards without making mistakes. And we'll settle for a punt at the 50 and we'll reload. The 46 was, you're not going to run the football in a running man's game. Like back in, especially in the 80s, you think about when they created this, like this is Rob Ryan. Buddy, Eagles, Rob. I think Rob was there. Anyways, this was running football back in the NFL, and you're not going to run the football, and we weren't sophisticated like we are now from a scheme standpoint in the passing game, where you had all these answers. You just, oh, well, we're going to go 4 wides. We're going to take out a fullback. We're going to put in 2 tight. We have 2 tight ends. They're both pass catchers. So there's so many different permutations to offenses now that running a 4-6 defense would be reserved for like short yardage goal line. Now, I'll say this. I love when you run a tight end attached. I love to put a guy mugged up on him and press him off the line of scrimmage. Just you think about a Gronkowski, you think about a Waller, anybody who will stay attached. That's a good pass catcher. The hardest thing for them to do in a 3-point stance is get off the line of scrimmage if you've got a big, strong guy right in their face. So I generally like that to disrupt that player because I think that player is so important in today's NFL. You can do that with a bigger safety and nickel. Now, what do you have? If you have 3 wide receivers and a tight end in, the guys in the slot, like you still got an issue with being able to bring the strong safety off the side or the nickel off the slot because now you're running a lot of stunt stuff where it's not really a run game deal, right? You're going to have some pass answers in the offense if you start running a lot of blitzes off of like one side, especially if you're always running to the slot because that's where that extra man is going to be. But the concept of running that mug look at tight end, I actually really like that if you have a person that can do it off the line of scrimmage because you can still, especially if you want to bracket that guy, that's the guy that you can bracket. You used to see this against Patriots used to do this against top-level players where they would, even if they were split out, they'd bracket them. They'd bump them off the line of scrimmage. Maybe the outside linebacker would bump and then come late, but you're really trying to disrupt that guy's timing and rhythm, right, depending on what kind of routes they run with the quarterbacks like. So there's elements of that, especially in the aggressive at the line of scrimmage play that I really like. But realistically, to install that as your base defense against a team that's running anything but 21 personnel, be really, really tough to do in today's National Football League because of the talent you have at the quarterback position. But I think more importantly, and this is kind of what we were talking about before, these coaches these days, I mean, Matt LaFleur would hope you enjoyed that talk, guys. Hit me up, Mike Wahle 68 on Twitter or X, Process to Perform on Instagram, and subscribe to that YouTube channel, Process to Perform. Block Party's out. Thank you, guys.